So thank you all for being here this evening. I'm Steve Madison, City Council member for West Pasadena. And there's a lot going on tonight. There's a big Planning Commission hearing over at City Hall involving the subject du jour that seems to overwhelm us, cannabis. And I know there are a couple of other community meetings, so I'm really grateful and buoyed by the turnout here. And also that it's not just folks from West Pasadena, but reflecting the importance of this issue citywide. I know we've got folks from all over the city, so thank you. I'm grateful. I've got just some housekeeping here, which is if you have a question for any of the panelists tonight, and I'll introduce them in a minute, please use one of these white slips, and we've got some great volunteers here that'll be passing those out and making those available to you. And then we also have these orange cards, which is not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but a big purpose for tonight is for you to tell us what you'd like to see here with this acreage that we hope to reacquire from Caltrans. So it's the card that says, what do you envision for Pasadena and for the stub? So please do fill both of those out, and we'll do the Q&A at the end of the program. So we're really grateful to have a great panel here tonight. First and foremost, our district director from Caltrans, John Bulinski, is here. David Reyes, our director of planning and permitting, is here. Laura Cornejo, our transportation director, and Tony Harris, consultant par excellence from Point C consulting firm and a transportation guru. And I will kick things off by sort of talking about what's brought us to this point. And of course, with people like Claire Bogart and Mick Hansen and others of you in the room, it's almost presumptuous of me to talk about the long battle that we had. But tonight, as I prepared to come over from home, my 22-year-old said, where are you going, Dad? And I said, well, we've got a forum related to the 710. And he said, Dad, are you still fighting that battle? And I explained, no, son, remember that, thanks to ultimately some legislation by both of our state legislators, Chris Holden with AB 29, and then Anthony Portantino with SB 7, officially the 710 was put to rest. And we're all deeply, deeply grateful for that. The 710 has been removed from the state's inventory of freeways. There's language in that legislation that protects the nonprofits and the residents that are there within the tranche of property that Caltrans acquired so many decades ago. And really a remarkable sort of case study in public policy, unlike any other, I think, in the country, comes to an end with this new legislation. But it creates questions and challenges and opportunities for us going forward. And some of you may be familiar with the work that was done in the Connecting Pasadena project that started a few years back, as we saw hopefully this time coming when we would have some opportunity. I've got some of the graphics up from that work, and you can see there in the photograph the ditch is quite evident there in the middle of the photograph. And this was from the Connecting Pasadena project. And I've already heard from a number of you with the idea that, well, this has all been decided. Why are you having a forum? And I really want to reassure you that nothing's been decided yet. And if you know anything about the way that we do things in Pasadena, this will be a long process of outreach and community participation. And truly, I want to assure you that nothing's yet been decided. Here we have a couple of graphic representations of the CPP came up with, I think, ultimately five different conceptual alternatives. The one on the left, I believe, would actually keep the ditch or the trench and work with it in that mode. And then on the right, it would actually be filled in so that it would be all at grade. And here are some pictures of different development massing that might occur alongside this property. And we've got some other graphic representations of it here. With regard, and I think those would be mostly David Reyes' bailiwick to talk to us about, whether we need a specific plan now or what sort of forward-thinking visioning we have to do to prepare for this. And then we move into transportation, and obviously Director Bulinski and Laura will speak about expectations with regard to the transportation alternatives. And this graphic actually shows on the left the network of streets and roads presently, and then on the right how they would look if some of them were restored as they previously were. And the concept that I think many of us are attracted to is some sort of meaningful public space, open space. Perhaps it's an esplanade, or like the great city streets. This is Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, but the idea that we have ample park space and open and recreational space as part of it. This is the different street configurations, pretty granular. That's a good sort of visual graph of what the area might look like, with the east on the top and the west to the bottom. Some different ideas in terms of residential development. As I'm sure you all know, we are under tremendous pressure from the state to add housing inventory. And again, David will be well equipped to talk about that, but certainly I'm sure there will be discussion of housing as part of this project. And there are some renderings of single-family homes and some multifamily as well. And I'll stop there with, again, a really good graphic or photographic image of the challenge and the opportunity that we have here with 50 acres in the middle of our city. It's almost like we're a brand new city and we're beginning from scratch to lay out what we want the roadways and the zoning requirements to be. But of course, for me, the starting point is history. This is not new acreage. This is 50 acres that used to be a very vibrant part of Pasadena. The demolitions occurred beginning in 1964, and I've become very interested in just the history, the people that lived there. This was a neighborhood, and it was largely a neighborhood with people of color, with African American communities. There were at least one very significant African American church that was demolished as part of this. There was a Presbyterian church that was also demolished. There was a small but important Japanese American community here. And so I think as we go forward, certainly that has to be one factor in our mind. What is the history? What was here before? And should we be deferential to that in terms of what we do going forward? I think another factor is the surrounding areas, and many of you will remember another battle that we had over the Ambassador College properties, which was 48 acres on either side of the trench, more toward the northerly part of it. But ultimately, we were able to save the Ambassador Auditorium, have Maranatha move in to some of the college facilities there, preserve a lot of historic housing units, and have fairly low impact residential development on the west. On the east side, I like to joke that my colleagues on the city council wanted a lot of multifamily housing, and I said over my dead body, and they said that can be arranged. And on 7-1 votes, we constructed something like 800 multifamily housing units there along Pasadena Avenue, and bordered by Del Mar to the south and DeLacy and even Green to the north. So I think those, almost like planetary objects, those will have an effect in terms of what we consider doing in terms of the trench. Another very important factor is, what are the legal requirements, not just those that we control locally, but and certainly Director Bulinski may be prepared to speak to some of these tonight, that will be required to meet some transportation objectives as part of this process called surplus where we will reacquire the property. The property was acquired by Caltrans for a transportation project that now is no more. We're working with Metro in terms of funding some other transportation improvement projects in the city, but certainly legal requirements will be paramount. And then, whatever our vision is for this, we will do it the Pasadena way. And that's as good a place as any for me to just acknowledge the presence of my dear friend, our former mayor, Bill Bogard is here. So can we welcome Bill Bogard? Yeah. Thank you, Bill. I also saw Teresa Lamb Simpson, and I certainly don't want to stray from the purpose of tonight's meeting, but Teresa is Adam Schiff's field representative, and boy, I'm very proud indeed to call Adam and Teresa my friend tonight. So, but without further ado, I'd like to go, I think, first to David Reyes and talk about the zoning and planning implications of this opportunity. And I know David has a presentation. Brian, can we switch over?
And thank you, Danny. Is this on? Thank you, Councilmember. In fact, the presentation that we have is a joint presentation. So the first portion is actually going to be Laura Cornejo speaking about some of what she's working on right now with respect to mobility, and then we'll jump into some planning. So I'm going to hand this over to Laura Cornejo.
Great, thank you. And good evening. I'll just wait a second to get the presentation up. So as the councilman was saying, the community has long advocated for an end to the 710 tunnel, the extension of the freeway, and you saw a victory in that when Caltrans put out the final environmental document identifying the TSM-TDM alternative as the locally preferred alternative. And that was great and a great victory, but now that closes the chapter on that environmental process. And what I can best think of is this is now a new chapter moving forward with a new process, a new collaborative relationship with Caltrans, and new partners, and as well as new opportunities for the community to engage and be part of this process when we get to that point. What was significant about Caltrans identifying TSM, TDM is that we are implementing other improvements that are capacity enhancement, that also look at bicycle, pedestrian infrastructure, and really looks at how people are moving in and about the city, and that we are working with Metro and securing funding and implementing those projects. But what's important also is that what closing that chapter on the 710 North environmental process did not do was it did not explicitly prohibit the possibility of a future 710 extension. It did not remove the corridor from the state highway system. And that's really what we're focused on now. And so what we want to speak to is a little bit of what that process is. So there's a lot of steps that we have moving forward. We have to look at relinquishment, mobility considerations, and then there's a community planning process. And David and I will speak to what that process looks like from the staff side, and then Tony and Mr. Bulinski will fill in a little bit more of the meat to that structure. Let me see, hold on. Did we start at the end? Is it not working? Hold on. Oh, I see. We started at the end, so. Excuse us, in reverse. We're going back in time here. It's okay. We just ruined the end for you. Okay, here we go. So, as Councilman Madison mentioned, in October, the governor signed two pieces of legislation that are really important for us moving forward. SB 7 by Portantino and AB 26 by Holden. Really puts us on a path towards relinquishment. What the legislation, the two pieces of legislation do is, one, it deems the 710th freeway extension as environmentally infeasible for closing that gap. And that's really important for what this community has really advocated for and pushed for. But I think really more significantly for the process moving forward is that effective January 1st, 2024, the corridor between Alhambra Avenue in the city of Los Angeles and California Boulevard in the city of Pasadena would no longer be on the state highway system. And so that's really important because that kind of is a prelude for being able to reclaim that corridor and have local ownership. What it also does is it indicates that once we reach an agreement with Caltrans as to what relinquishment will look like, the California Transportation Commission will consider whether it's in the state's best interest to transfer ownership over to local jurisdictions. And so what we will be doing for the next several months is really working with Caltrans very closely to develop those terms of those agreements and what that looks like. So let's see. So initially, what we need to do is carry out a feasibility assessment. And what that will do is at a very high level, try to reconcile the two goals and objectives that both Pasadena and Caltrans have. From the state perspective, there's a state highway system that people want to and need to get to, the 134, the 210. And so how do we help people get access and get to that state highway network? From the local perspective, we really want to focus on reconnecting neighborhoods and a street grid that helps facilitate local mobility and access. And so how do we reconcile those two? So for the next several months, we'll be working with Caltrans on defining what that looks like. And to be clear, what we will not do is predetermine what a street grid is. We will not assume that the different design or configurations that you saw just a couple moments ago is what is set in stone. The best way I can describe this process is we will be kind of developing the parameters or a box that indicate what, the box that we can color within. Really at a high level, looking at how people are moving, how we anticipate people will move to and through the city. And really what we want to make sure is that people can have regional access, but also have local mobility. And so we will be working on that. The other part of it is we'll be looking at what the cost of doing that is and having those conversations with Caltrans, state of good repair, looking at what the condition of the corridor is, and having those conversations so that at the end of the day, we have as much information as we can in order to come to an agreement and then go to the CTC and say, we've figured this out, we'd like some local control over the corridor. Again, once we get there, there's a lot to consider. And we put a couple things up here only because we recognize that solving this transportation issue is complex and it's multifaceted. So I talked about reconnecting neighborhoods, and the councilman talked about what this community used to look like and what it used to be. There's some real opportunities here to look forward and really understand how people are moving, approach this from a multimodal perspective if that's what the community wants, but really at the end of the day, understanding that our goal is to reconnect neighborhoods and allow and facilitate movement through the city of Pasadena. There's a number of projects that we don't know what the future is, but we have to take that into consideration. There's the North Hollywood to Pasadena BRT project. That Metro is in the environmental process. We don't know what the Metro Board of Directors will ultimately decide for that project. There's also funding that Metro has allocated to the city for a potential grade separation at California Avenue. Again, that will go through its own separate process, design, and environmental process with its own community engagement. We don't know what the end of that project will be either, or whether it will even solve the issue we're trying to solve. But all of this to say that there are a number of opportunities here and projects that we have to consider once we get to that stage in planning. And with that, I will hand it over to David.
Thank you, Laura. And I think what you heard is, I think there's a lot of good news initially. First being that the 710 tunnel idea and connecting the 710 through our city is not going to happen. The really important aspect of what stage we're in right now is that the unknowns that Laura talked about are all going to be known at some point and end with the city's goal of actually reclaiming the 710 area for the city of Pasadena. So the goal is that we get it back and that we get to determine what that future use looks like. Laura talked about the many things that they need to look at with respect to ensuring this partnership between the state and the city move forward in a way that allows us to actually get that land back. There are a lot of planning considerations that are going to happen. It's important that Laura talked about a larger box that they need to stay within. It's also important that the process that DOT and the state engage in don't preclude some of the city's potential future desires for the land. And so there is an internal working group comprised of city staff as well as Point C with respect to our consultant work. As we continue to work with Caltrans, planning will be involved to a degree. We're not going to necessarily get involved in the technical aspects of how off-ramps should work, but we do want to ensure that the potential future land use pattern is not impacted in a way that really precludes something that the community might want to see going forward. And you see up on the screen this idea of looking at infrastructure, land use, density, intensity, design standard. This is a blank slate. And it really starts and is going to start with community input. We need to understand what is expected here. Yes, the CPP was a great project because it established the city's own identity for what could happen here and didn't allow Caltrans to just say, we're going to do a tunnel. And I think that there were a lot of great aspects of the CPP project that potentially can use as a base, as a point of discussion, but it's not cooked. There needs to be community input in a way that is more broad. There's no zoning on the property. There needs to be basic issues of what would the city like to see here? Is it a combination of all the things that you've heard? Is it a combination of residential open space? Is it mixed use? Is it going to be multifamily? Is it low scale duplexes? The state may have a say in that as well. We don't own the land today. As the Caltrans and the city continue to work together towards relinquishment, the state may feel that it's very important that there be affordable housing on this property. They may feel that as any future consideration is given, that a certain percentage, and that the city has a required 20% inclusionary, they may feel like whatever gets developed there is a percentage of it is affordable or workforce or moderate. And I think that we need to go forward with an open mind. And the graphic is important. I don't know if I can go backwards, Laura. I can try. I can. The graphic is important because it shows the planning process up there at the top. We are not there. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before we can be serious about entertaining ideas because, again, we don't own the property today. We don't know exactly what condition or requirements the state may impose upon us as we look for relinquishment or some other process where that the city can own it. But I do expect fully, I've only been in the city 8 years, but what I know is that community input is valuable and is going to happen. Councilmember Madison talked about the Pasadena Way. We do need to engage the community. I do feel that a specific plan is probably the right tool to figure out the land use and ultimate design for this area. And I think that the communities, the community leaders that have helped on the CPP are going to be really valuable to that future process. But right now, the point of tonight, you're going to hear from Mr. Bulinski, you're going to hear from Tony. There's a lot of technical issues that we need to get through. But from a planning perspective, we need to have real community input, and our department hasn't engaged in that yet. We're really excited about the opportunity to say that, yes, the 710 is dead with respect to a tunnel or some other connection. Now we can start thinking about the real planning opportunity. This is, I would say, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for this area, and we're excited to hear from the community, to engage in a process that could be something that's really, really cool from a planning and land use perspective, not just we talked about the fabric being sort of re-knit back together. This idea of reconnecting the fabric of Pasadena, but doing it in a way that's responsible, that respects growth, that does respect and understand that there's been a lot of development recently, that there's a lot of traffic in the city. All of those things need to be considered, and they will. And I suspect that in the very near future, in the next year, as DOT, as the city, as Caltrans make progress, you're going to start hearing more about this process and what it looks like going forward. Right now, this is the roadmap, and we're at the beginning stages, and we're happy to be here and answer future questions that you might have.
Thank you, David and Laura. And just, Laura, on the point that you made about the Metro BRT, is that the principally bus way and the dedication of bus lines? And I think I saw one version that had it going from North Hollywood all the way to PCC. Correct. So it would definitely impact our city. I think we've taken a position that we have our own local bus service, and that we would like to not see any of our major arteries have dedicated bus lines. You came from Metro, so that's a project that I know you'll be very much on top of. I also want to make sure that everybody knows about the various sort of storyboards that are outside and here in the room. When you're outside, take a moment to look at some of the historic photos of the homes and the businesses that were there before, and there are some other great depictions of demolitions and what have you. And then, in particular, with these orange cards, we have two photos at the back that show the site, and then there's an insert, and I think the insert actually is the site as it looked before. And in particular, with regard to sort of standing at those photos, feel free to just express your opinion in any way, shape, or form of what you think should happen there. Should it be filled in? Should it not be filled in? Should it be covered over? Should it all be a park? Should it all be housing? Should it all be something else? We really do, as David said, we really do want to hear from you about that. So if we could then, why don't we move to sort of focusing more a bit on the transportation aspects and the continuing the discussion of this process. And I think Director Bulinski and Tony, I'll leave it to you to divide the time and address it as you would.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you. I'm really encouraged by the turnout we have here tonight. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into. As long as I make it out the door alive, I think I'm good. So a couple of things that I just wanted to touch on. I'm not going to speak at length because there is a lot of questions I'm sure that you have that we're more than willing to take and try to answer. So first and foremost, I came to District 7 about 13 months ago from Riverside San Bernardino District. And 1 month into my tenure here, I signed a document, which was the environmental document for the 710 North project. So at the risk of getting myself in trouble with the council member, at that point, a decision was made for Pasadena and for 710 North. And that was to implement the preferred alternative that's identified in that document as the TSM-TDM. I'm sure many of you have heard that term ad nauseum. But that, in essence, what that allows is for us to start to implement some smaller projects that facilitate the movement of people through the entire region, with a focus for our Caltrans facilities, which are the stub at the south end, Fair Oaks at 110, and then the north end stub in Pasadena. So there's some schematics that are included in the environmental document for each of those. And those are environmental level type of schematics. So obviously they're not detailed engineering drawings that would be able to move into a construction type of, or allow for construction to take place. So what I'm getting at is there is now the next opportunity. And that is the opportunity for us to work in partnership with the city, as was mentioned earlier, to identify what does take place at the northern stub, But keeping in mind that we still need to consider the environmental document, what's included in there, because we don't want to jeopardize the integrity of that document. Because if we do that, then there's a potential that we'll have to go back in time and prepare another environmental document. So with that, obviously there's a need for us to continue to manage traffic. We have a freeway system on either end of this that provides for the movement of people. We have about 45,000 average daily vehicles that use the northern stub, and we need to make sure that we are providing an efficient system for those vehicles to continue that use. That being said, that doesn't mean that the existing network that's there has to remain in place as is. There can certainly be modifications, and I think Tony is here to talk about some of the concepts that are in place there. So I'm just going to end with, at this point, I'm really excited. I'm excited that we're at this stage, we're at this point in time. I know many of you have spent a significant number of years working on this. Now the real work begins, I would say, because now how do we mesh the needs of the community, the needs of the transportation system, so that they can work together. And I will tell you that I'm here to roll up my sleeves and work with you and make sure that we arrive at a solution that is acceptable to, I'm not going to say everybody, because there's always going to be those few that can't agree, but the majority. So thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tony Harris, and I'm a partner for a transportation consultant firm called Point C, based right here in Pasadena. And I guess some of you goes, why is he up there in particular? You know, we have a district director, we have another department director, you got another department director, and then you got me here. But it is a pleasure to be here because the opportunity I have is to work in collaboration with Caltrans and the city as we begin to take advantage of this great opportunity that we have in front of us. I want to compliment John Bulinski for his openness and his collaboration. I mean, from day one. For those of you that don't know, I used to sit in his job, all right? And, you know, he's doing it better than I did. Right, John? All right, along the way. But you heard a lot from Laura, you heard from both David and John, and what we're planning to do is a smaller working group that's going to be focusing on some of the technical constraints and, more importantly, opportunities we have. When I first started getting engaged with this, I kept hearing, we're going to remove the stub at the north. We're going to remove the stub at the north. And I remember saying to a few people, what does that mean? I like something more tangible. And it's our job to begin to put some parameters around it to help define what that means. With the decisions that happen with the environmental document, the stub, it was designed to be a connection between two freeways, all right? There will not be two freeways that you have to connect to. So what type of transportation connection do you really need that provides the access and the mobility that you heard some of my other panel members up here talking about? You can look at a freeway connection to a local facility connection. Now, there's different ways to make that connections, but there's factors that you want to make sure you take into account when you're doing that. First and foremost, it's got to be safe, all right? Safety, I think, trumps everything, and that's critical, and safety takes the form of a lot of different ways people travel, the way they move, and those type of things. And it has to be functional, all right? Now, how do you define functional? Mobility is one part of it, but functional for multiple different modes and those type of things along the way. Last I looked out there, there's a big ditch, all right? There's technical issues that has to be looked at and how you address that. I mean, do you fill it? Do you not fill it? How do you address drainage? How do you facilitate movements back and forth? How do you make a connection so that it doesn't back up and create safety issues on the freeway system or on the local system overall? So our intent is to really focus in identifying some of those technical feasibilities and to do it in collaboration, not just city staff, not just Caltrans staff, but to do it together. I'm a firm believer that in working together in this partnership approach, then we agree on what the information, and I think it helps sets up and moving the process forward. Now, moving that process forward, you have to know what that connection will look like to answer the question about relinquishment. First and foremost, you got to decide what's relinquished, okay? Where does the state facility end? Where would the local facility end? I mean, you know, the state's not going to own all of it, and Pasadena's not going to own the freeway either, but there's a line in there that has to be defined and looking at it in that regard. We want to move quickly in defining what some of those technical feasibility and constraints are. And when I say quickly, over the next several months, and working, we're going to look at traffic information, we're going to look at technical information from an engineering perspective, line of sight, changes in the grade, what bridges do we connect up to in the context with everything else that's going on. But it's not based upon any future land use scenario because we don't have any. Right now, the land is owned by the state. We don't know how much land get frees up after you figure out the transportation concept. And once we understand all that information, then there's things that has to take place. Have to go back and update things like the freeway agreement between Caltrans and the city, which define access. Things like that will lead into the further discussion that you heard quite a bit about relinquishment and those parts of it. But I had the pleasure of being able to work with some very bright and very talented people at both of the public agencies and with our support to get through this technical feasibility and define what some of these concepts could be. For example, I would give you a question. If you look at that freeway-to-freeway connection out there now, it's actually a freeway-to-freeway connection to both the 210 and the 134. And it's got a lot of high-speed connections. Is that what you really need when it's not going to be a freeway or not? Those are the type of questions that we want to collect information and begin to analyze those type of things. And our goal is to work our way through that over the next, 3 to 4 months in our process. So with that, I'm going to pause, and so we can entertain questions.
Okay, well, thank you to all four of our panelists, and we do have some great questions here. Again, if you have questions, write them on the white piece of paper, and our volunteers can grab those from you and bring them up. And I'm trying to organize them here, but maybe, Tony, to start with you and all of you, I think this is an excellent question. What are the steps that need to be followed to actually accomplish the transfer of the stub from the state to the city of Pasadena?
I will start, and actually I think I need to kind of let John, who's kind of is the state, answer it more a little bit. You heard John talk about that we have a transportation system that's functional, and we have to come up with a solution that is going to be functional, all right? You can't just all of a sudden take something out and say, I'm just going to relinquish it, and then all of a sudden you create unintended consequences along the way. So it's going to be important to identify concepts, potential concepts of what that new transportation connection could look like. Is it a connection for the local arterial, and where is that first connection with the state facility? And that will help define it. That will begin to help set the boundaries of the right-of-way or what needs to remain as part of a transportation system and help free that part up. Once you have that information, then you could start going through the actual steps of developing more detailed concept designs, develop more agreements on what needs to be relinquishment, and then going through that formal process of relinquishment. But I will defer to John to add on to that as needed.
So he sat in my chair before and he answered it pretty well, I think. Other than, the only thing I would add is that getting to the final solution is the critical element. Making sure that we are accommodating the traffic, we're accommodating the needs of the community, we're coming up with a plan that can be implemented. And then going through the process of the agreements, we do have to go to the California Transportation Commission to get final approval for any type of relinquishment. So that's part of the process, and process obviously does take time, and for good reason, because we want to be thoughtful about the final result.
Mr. Bulinski, one of the questions that I think that we've been getting a lot, and I'm sorry, Councilmember Madison, but real quick, do you anticipate that additional legislation is going to be required before there's relinquishment?
No. No, the legislation that was passed allows for relinquishment to proceed.
And then a related question is, as we understand, the legislation has a deadline, if you will, of 2024 for resolution of the stub. So how do you reconcile that with these complex processes that you just described?
Okay, so I'll answer that as best I can. The 2024 date is really set to allow us to take some time to work on this, and then to allow the process to continue to develop and end up at the point where we can go to the CTC. There was a lot of debate back and forth on why it was 2024, and quite honestly, I don't know why it ended up in the legislation 2024. But it is going to take time for us to get to the point where we can go to the CTC and request relinquishment. And so I think that's basically the reason why that was put into the legislation.
I think, please, Tony.
What I'd like to add, though, is just because a date and legislation is there doesn't mean we need to take that long. All right. I think if we are setting up a process where we're working in partnership and we can define things and come to consensus and agreement, it's nothing that say we can't go earlier if we get there in that regards. I've worked on relinquishment quite a bit in my career, and the ones that go well are the ones where the two public agencies are in lockstep, working hand in hand together, or in agreement on all the details. And it makes it very simple for the California Transportation Commission to go, okay, right. The ones that are challenging is where there's just still a lot of disagreement. We haven't really worked our way through it. And that's why I'm excited about the opportunity to work in this working group to define what those things are up front and then map out how we're going to accomplish and work our way through it.
Well, I think, Tony, you're speaking our language. Coach Wooden used to say, be quick, but don't hurry. And I think, 2024 to us sounds like a long ways off. So certainly at the council, I know we're dedicated to moving with all due speed. We have a lot of questions about the Caltrans properties sort of apart from the ditch itself. And I know, Mr. Director Bulinski, you mentioned the transportation management expertise of Caltrans. I'm not sure you disagree with me that property management isn't the primary scope of your agency. So what can we expect in terms of the disposition of the property, the residential properties that were acquired as part of this project that's now been ended?
Okay, so I'll speak to this. I'm not going to get into detail because there's a long, drawn-out process that was established by legislation for disposal of what we call disposal. I know that's a negative term. Of properties that we own that we no longer need for transportation purposes. The residential, the commercial, the vacant lands that we do not need because we are not building a freeway will be provided for sale. There is what we call the Roberti Act that we have to follow, which establishes requirements for us a process for us to follow when we dispose of properties. There's also an affordability element within that legislation, as well as some follow-up pieces of legislation that were approved by the governor not too long ago. The problem with all those pieces of legislation is now we need to develop regulations that allow us to proceed forward. So those regulations are now under development. We're getting very close to finalizing those. There is, and I'll end here, there is a lawsuit that's also having an impact on us proceeding forward with sale of some of the properties. So we're really trying to get past the lawsuit and those new regulations put in place so that we can start to put the sales out on the street.
And I don't want to get too granular because, again, people are, especially tenants, for example, are very interested in this. But is it your expectation that Caltrans will be doing repairs and maintenance and upkeep? Or I think from where we sit, the sooner the better. Those homes can be moved into the hands of the owners. That would be a better outcome.
Absolutely, and I agree. The sooner we can, because we are not a property management department. I'm sure many of you will agree with that. Our expertise is transportation. Our expertise is not managing properties. And my goal coming in here is to do everything I can to get these out of our ownership into the ownership of those people that need them.
So, David, we have a bunch of questions about the process. And as I predicted, there's a question. The CPP seems to be a done deal. Will the public have an opportunity, and I would read this, a meaningful opportunity to redesign what should go into the stub?
I think it's important, Councilmember, to recognize that the CPP was not sponsored by the city. The city council didn't, put funding towards it. It was a very important community sort of grassroots effort. And those of you that are familiar with it, a lot of extremely talented professionals gave up a lot of their time and effort to come up with that plan. But it is not the plan. The city council has not endorsed that and told staff to go run and implement that plan. So there is going to be, frankly, real meaningful community outreach to establish what the future looks like for this area. From the very beginning, there's this idea of urban renewal that was very popular in the 70s throughout the country, resulted in a lot of challenges for neighborhoods in terms of trying to reconnect what's been broken. And I think that we have a unique opportunity. There's other areas throughout the country that have engaged in similar processes, literally from across the country, including a great example that's recently been completed in Vancouver. The infrastructure, the cost alone, one of the things that Councilmember Madison showed on the screen was this idea where you fill in the ditch and then you build above grade. Looks pretty good on paper, in concept maybe. That is going to be an expensive proposition if that's ultimately what happens. That could be a fantastic solution. I suspect that there's going to be infrastructure needs where we may even create our own little district where we need funding. There are so many things to consider. For anyone to say that the CPP is the done deal, I think it's wrong. We do think it's important to sort of consider that and just look at that from what it is. But I want to be honest with the community. We're starting from ground zero, literally.
Yeah, and I would just echo that from the council's perspective. I mean, those of you who have followed the YWCA project know that in Pasadena, even a done deal isn't a done deal sometimes. And certainly here, the CPP has not, it's been presented to the council in an information item. The sort of political history of that was rather than just being against the 710, we should be able to say something positive about what we might be interested in doing there. But by no means in any way has it been approved at any level. And that sort of leads to the next question, which is how and when can residents and other stakeholders get involved in the planning process to shape the outcome here?
I suspect that as DOT, the city manager's office, and Caltrans continue to work together, we would be bringing information items to the city council. We would share progress, and I think there will be a point in time, I don't know when it's going to be, I suspect in the next 6 months, where we have a better understanding of potentially where we might want to go. And I think probably within the next year, Councilmember, it's going to be important that as the specific plan update process that we're currently undertaking, the 8 specific plans are being updated in the city. We're going to start phase 3 this spring. and we expect that through 2021 we will be done with those. I think it's important that we start thinking very quickly about the future of this area, because 2024 will be here before we know it. There's nothing in the legislation that says the plan needs to be approved in 2024. There needs to be a plan for relinquishment, meaning Caltrans and DOT need to be satisfied that there is a transportation future plan, but there's nothing in the legislation that says there needs to be a planning plan, meaning that what's the future. But I think that we should take advantage of this opportunity to combine them. What is it that we're looking at on the transportation side? How can we ensure that the transportation future is not in conflict, and that the land use pattern that we want to develop there takes into consideration whatever Caltrans and the city ultimately agree to, or I guess ultimately the CTC, which is the California Transportation Commission, ultimately has to do the relinquishment. But I would say within the next 6 months, we'd be presenting something to the city council as an information item, and then probably get direction from the council there.
And I think this is a very important question, and it's legitimately a question, seeking information. Is the land use decided by the state or by the city or by some other process? And there's some suspicion that the state will hand us an envelope that says you've got to have this many square feet of this type of construction.
So truly a unique opportunity, Councilmember. I don't know that there's an exact blueprint that would, so typically in a relinquishment where the state or some other agency does relinquish land back to the city, it's up to the city to zone it. That land is currently not zoned. There is no zoning there, so meaning there is no plan for development there. One needs to be developed. What we don't know, none of us really know right now, is through the relinquishment process, are there going to be state interest? This is a lot of land. This is an area that is potentially, the governor has a resolution, I want to say it's about a year old now, but it seeks to, on state surplus land, build affordable housing. This is a little different than the state surplus land that I think that resolution was intended to address. But with all of the state legislation on housing, and the more and more we're seeing bills come out of Sacramento, I would suspect that potentially the state may want to engage the city in having a dialogue about what happens there, but none of us know that for sure. And as we continue to move down this path, I think these things are kind of crystallized in the next year or so.
And of course, there the irony is palpable, with all due respect to the state. On the one hand, really strongly pressuring us to provide affordable housing. On the other hand, owning some hundreds of homes that could be used one way or the other for affordable housing. I would suggest the first place the state could start is by surplusing those homes, either to us or the owners or the nonprofits, and let us go about the business of providing affordable housing.
I can send them over to you.
But a couple of questions about the EIR, and again, not to become too, environmental CEQA lawyers here, but Director Bulinski mentioned protecting the integrity of the EIR. There's a question about that. There's another question about would a new EIR or an amended EIR be required? That's probably a broad question, but I wonder what all of your take is on that.
So I'll just start with, the future plan, whatever specific plan or other idea that the city ultimately comes up with for the future of the ditch, it would be subject to its own environmental review and a brand new EIR from a planning perspective.
Was that what you were talking about, Director Bulinski, or something else?
No, what I was talking about is the existing environmental document that was signed a year ago, making sure that the purpose and need that is identified in that document, and I don't have it memorized, I apologize, is still met with whatever proposal is being presented. And again, there's a lot of flexibility in that, but still we want to make sure that we meet the intent of that document. That's not to say that we can't go back and do some modifications or do a separate supplemental type of document. I just don't think this group or anybody would really want to open up a brand-new process that ends up with a new
And to
EIR.
be clear, what you're referring to is environmental review with respect to whatever is the city and Caltrans' idea for this relinquishment, so that before the CTC does something, that we're not triggering some additional environmental review. And there could be different levels. It could be an addendum. It could be something else. But I think the point that you're making is that there is an EIR done, and to the extent that our agreement and the CTC wants to do something, we'd like to stay within the box of the environmental analysis that's been done.
Correct.
Yeah, let me add to that a little bit. I mean, purpose and need is kind of different language to a lot of you in particular, all right? And so the reality of it is, it's a facility that we need to move people through, or in that regards. And that's why it's important as we work collectively as a group with Caltrans in the city in defining the transportation concepts that is in agreement with everybody. That may mean that those particular transportation concepts we come up with may have to have some additional follow-up environmental work, specifically just for that part of it overall. But it isn't necessary where we're looking at a stub that's basically trying to solve the regional overall freeway system challenge. It's very localized that we're working through it, but there is a certain amount of context that we want to make sure we're consistent with.
And I think what we're all talking about is that need to balance out what Caltrans' initial purpose for connecting the freeways was, and how you get people to the state network with what our local goals are. And that's what this process ultimately is about, that we need to be true to what that initial environmental document was, which was connecting people, but doing that through the lens of local mobility. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're all here trying to accomplish.
And just so we're clear, we're not saying that those 45,000 trips need to continue to occupy some part of that parcel. Right. We're looking at projects to the east in terms of, well, a variety of projects, of traffic improvement projects, but it's really just how we address the need, albeit on a larger scale, hopefully.
Right. I mean, it's understanding how people move, how many people move through the city, what happens if we put a corridor along a certain location, what happens if the street grid looks differently, where will people then get diverted to? That's really kind of the box that we've been talking about before we really fill it in. And one of the things that David and I are doing is we're coordinating very closely on this, because there will be a point where we have enough clarity and we understand what this box will look like, so that we can start the specific plan process, so that we can start to fill in the details as to what this transportation network will look like.
So Laura, I did have some questions on specific transportation issues. So for example, there's a strong desire among many to restore certainly some of those important streets to their original widths, replace the sidewalks, have trees and parkways, take them back to two-way streets instead of the one-way orientation that they have now. I wonder what your take is on that, either sort of procedurally or substantively.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the more detailed planning process that David and I will be working on together with the community, really looking at how do we design the street network, whether it's a more localized street network, whether it's there are some connector streets. What does that look like? Are there one-way streets that are currently one-way streets that might better operate best if they become two-way streets, or vice versa? That is what the process will be. On my end, it's looking at how people are traveling and how we can get people through more efficiently, without precluding opportunities for economic development. And that's why, my job and Tony's job, along with Mr. Bulinski, is to get us to the point where we understand enough to be able to start getting to what I think is really the fun stuff, the details, and really the visioning of what you would like this part of your community to be.
Very important issue for West Pasadena, and probably the city at large, is the need to be able to get to Huntington Hospital, which is our only hospital now in Pasadena. It has an ER, obviously. I have 3 fire stations in my council district, as you know, and for at least 2 of those, they would have to come, from points westerly So are we committed to ensuring that there will be clear and rapid access to Huntington Hospital so that, in those cases where a minute or two makes the difference, we're landing on the right side?
Yeah, absolutely. Tony spoke to safety being of paramount, and that's really what's going to drive this. And again, safety looks very differently if you're talking about from a pedestrian versus first responders, or if you're in a car. But really what will be driving this at the top of the list is safety, mobility, access.
And just to add to that, safety takes the shape of a lot of different things. I mean, with Caltrans, sometimes it's about traffic getting so congested that it's backing up and getting into a fast lane, so it creates safety problems. Other things with this corridor, now that you don't necessarily have the freeway going through there, you're going to go to a local facility, and you're going to have other multiple uses coming through here. How do you make sure you're addressing potential safety concerns related to that? And access to first responders and those key features. I mean, perfect example, when John's talking about the previous environmental document, that was a key point that was considered. And that's a key point that we would have to make sure we continue to look at that as well.
So some of us are familiar with the notion that we have streets through Pasadena that Caltrans, and I'm not talking about the stump now, I'm talking about at other locations at different points in time, that they look to be city or local streets, but they're actually controlled by Caltrans. We worked for years to get a left turn movement at Colorado and Orange Grove, right where the 134 off-ramp terminates. And that was an issue that we had to work with Caltrans on, and thank you, we did get that left turn movement, and it's been great. After this process is completed, one questioner wants to know, will the state still be exercising control over how the city uses the land and the transportation?
So once we go through the process and we ultimately end up at a point where we are relinquishing control of state highway right-of-way to the city, that segment that is relinquished now comes under the control of the city. So the city has the ability to make modifications to that transportation system.
And the state would have no role in terms of zoning per se, other than these initial discussions about the transition?
No, the state does not take a role, at least the Department of Transportation does not take a role in zoning.
We have some questions about specific uses, and I think these are probably self-evident, but would it be possible to have just a park there? Would it be possible to just have single-family homes there? Can we guarantee, this question actually uses that word, can we guarantee that there will not be more congestion due to the new land use? This is where the council member turns to staff and
Define congestion.
I'll speak just briefly to that. The projection for population increase in California is 10 million people in the next 25 years. So yes, there will be more congestion. So that is why it's incumbent upon us to really look at alternatives. How do we move, instead of looking at how do we move automobiles, how do we move people? And I think this is a golden opportunity, and we can be the leaders and the pioneers in getting to that resolution. We have Executive Order 1919. How many have heard of that one? 1919. So the governor put out Executive Order 1919 in September, which requires Caltrans to look at active transportation, to look at alternative modes, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Because combined, it's important. So really moving the needle towards implementing change in the department so that, again, we're not just moving automobiles. We're looking at all modes of transportation to get people to their destination.
So for getting the ditch, Councilmember, on December 9th, we're going to come before you and provide an update on some of the state legislation and some other CEQA issues to the full city council. One of the things that's looming out there is that this city, well, every city in the state is about to get hit with their new RHNA numbers, and that regional housing needs assessment basically is setting forth a city's responsibility to produce housing for the next 8-year cycle. And for us right now, the last cycle, our cycle is going to end in 2021. Our last cycle was a total of 1,300 units. The next cycle, what we're projecting based on all the numbers right now, is on the low end 8,000 and on the high end 12,000. That's regardless of the ditch. And the thing that's changed with the state is not only the RHNA numbers and the allocation used to be what the city should plan for. Now what the state's trying to hold cities to is not only what they should plan for, but what they should build. And the challenges that we're going to have into the future are going to be many. Again, regardless of the ditch, we're going to need to make sure that we're planning for it, and making sure that whatever state legislation comes down the pike, that we're prepared to continue to plan Pasadena the way that we want to plan it. And I guess all that to say that there likely will be a population growth in the city. There will be, it's important to grow. And I think that the thing that I've learned about Pasadena is that Pasadena has wanted to grow the way it's wanted to grow in a very responsible manner. We've done, I hate to say our fair share, but we've done our fair share on the housing side. This last cycle, we've produced more than that 1,300 units. The city has plans with respect to zoning, with respect to height, with respect to density, that the state has continued to sort of take away and say we should build more. SB 50 is going to come back. Those of you that are aware of that bill, it's more density in and around the transit corridors. And I think that we should be prepared for the state to continue imposing legislation on us. We should recognize that housing is needed in the state. We should try to figure out how we can do it the way that we'd like to see it done. But for us to say that we're not going to produce housing, I don't think is an option. For us to say that there's not going to be change is not an option. For us to say there's not going to be additional congestion, whatever that means exactly. I think the reality is that we are going to see change. And I think that if there's a way that we can control it and do it the way that we'd like to see it done, I think that's going to be the challenge for us the next couple of years, Councilmember.
Yeah, and I want to offer kind of a counterbalance to that, which is, if you listen carefully, what we're being told, and these individuals are speaking very transparently and truthfully, what we're being told by the state is the regional and the statewide population is expected to grow. Therefore, each city has to accommodate growth, part of that growth within its city. And I think where many of us come from is we may reach a point where we kind of like the size of our family, as it were, as it is. And we don't want to have to accommodate additional population, recognizing that it has to have an impact on our quality of life, on our ability to move about freely and the like. Certainly, we're committed to a just and fair portfolio of housing. And if you want to talk about setting aside, and we've been very progressive about that, affordable housing within our housing stock. But the idea that the state gets to keep telling us year after year, more, we are going to reach a point where we have to agree to disagree with them. And I will tell you, the shortest amount of time measurable to man is the time it takes a newly elected state legislator to remember what it was like being a local official, because these mandates that come down are quite daunting sometimes. But David, you mentioned, or I did, both of us, a specific plan process. What would that look like?
So first of all, the city council would have to direct staff to undertake that. And a specific plan process is basically a process where zoning regulations are set up such that you have an entire set of development parameters for a specific area that includes the density, the types of land uses, the heights, including what the infrastructure needs are. And it's a really detailed look at ensuring that a certain area is developed a certain way, in a way that the city wants to see it grow. So it's very very specific in terms of what development can happen there. And I think the city's entire development pattern is based around specific plans. We have 8 specific plans in the city. We have 6 transit stops, and all of our growth currently, as the council member talked about, us wanting to push back, we have done a fantastic job of allowing growth in and around the central district, along the commercial corridors, along the north, south, east, west, along Colorado, along Lake Lincoln. There has been a designed and set pattern of development to allow growth responsibly and still protect the single-family neighborhoods. This would be potentially another example of a specific plan that has single-family, multifamily surrounding it that would need to be done and take into consideration, Councilmember, all of the things that the community wants to see here from a land use perspective.
I can sense some restlessness in the room, and I want to leave you time to fill out your orange cards, and the lighting is kind of difficult. Is that my colleague, Victor Gordo, that just came in? Yeah, City Council member Victor Gordo. He and I sit next to each other every Monday night, so thank you, Victor, for being here. Thanks very much. So I want to really thank our panelists for taking the time. Obviously, this is, the beginning of a long, long process and many more discussions like this to come. And thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you.